She stood at the door of the church in a dress that had been washed so many times the white had gone the color of old teeth. Her hands were folded in front of her. She was not trembling. She had decided the night before, in the dark of the room she shared with 2 other girls at the orphanage, that she would not tremble. She would walk through whatever door they opened for her because there was no other door. And the man waiting at the altar, the man they had told her about, the man the church administrator had arranged the match with, was 95 years old, dressed in a coat that smelled of must and river water, leaning on a wooden cane so worn it had gone smooth from decades of use. And every person in that small gathering, every face she could see, was looking at her with the same expression. Not pity. Something worse than pity. Something that looked like relief that it was her standing there and not them. What none of them knew, what she could not have known, what not a single person in that room had any reason to suspect, was that the old man leaning on that cane had more money sitting untouched in accounts they had never heard of than any of them would see in 10 lifetimes. But we are not starting there. To understand what happened in that church, you have to understand who Amara was before she ever set foot inside it. She was born during the rainy season in a year when the rains came too hard and too long and flooded the lower roads and left the whole district smelling of wet earth and overripe fruit for weeks afterward. Her mother, Iphioma, was 23 years old and already tired in a way that had nothing to do with age. Her father had left before Amara could form a memory of him, left for what he called opportunity and what everyone else in the family called cowardice. Iphioma raised Amara in a single room attached to her own mother's house, a room with a low ceiling and a concrete floor that stayed cold even in the dry season, with a window that faced a wall and let in no direct light but only the reflected brightness of the sky above. Iphioma was not a complaining woman. She cooked groundnut soup on a small gas burner she had bought secondhand and repaired herself 3 times when it stopped working. She braided hair on Saturdays and Sundays for extra income, sitting on a low stool in the compound with her neighbor's children running between her feet while her hands moved through someone else's hair with a patience and care she seemed to keep in limitless supply. She told Amara stories at night. Not the kind with morals attached, but the kind that were simply beautiful, where animals spoke and rivers listened and the sky kept its own counsel about everything it witnessed from up there. When Amara was 7, Iphioma got sick. It was not dramatic. It was the kind of sickness that arrives quietly and spreads quietly, and by the time anyone is certain it is serious, it has already made itself at home. Cough that wouldn't leave. A thinning that started in her face and moved through her body like a slow fire, taking everything combustible and leaving the structure standing but hollow. The clinic said one thing. The hospital said another. The money ran out before either of them could be proven right. Amara was 9 years old when she sat beside her mother's bed and watched Iphioma's chest rise and fall with that particular labored rhythm that sounds like effort and determination all at once. She held her mother's hand. Iphioma's hand was dry and light, the kind of light that frightens you because weight is presence and you can feel the presence leaving. Iphioma looked at her daughter and said very clearly, in a voice that had used up almost everything it had left, "You are not what has happened to you. You are what you decide to do with what has happened to you. Remember that." Amara remembered it. She remembered it the way you remember things that arrive at the exact moment your whole world is opening beneath your feet. The words fall straight down into the deepest part of you and stay there. Iphioma died 4 days later. Amara was taken to her grandmother's house, but her grandmother was already an old woman with her own particular failing, and within 18 months, the grandmother too was gone. There were aunts and uncles who came for the funeral, who stood in the compound in their good clothes and spoke in low voices about responsibility and family obligation, and then got into their cars and drove away and did not come back. The church women came for Amara on a Tuesday morning. She was 11 years old. She carried a plastic bag with 2 dresses, a pair of sandals, a small Bible her mother had given her, and a photograph of Iphioma that she had found tucked inside the pages of a notebook. She held the plastic bag with both hands and she did not cry. She had learned already, the way that some children learn very early and carry that learning forever, that crying uses energy you might need for something else. The orphanage was a compound of 3 low buildings set around a central yard where a neem tree stood so large and old it seemed to belong to a different era entirely. There were 22 children when Amara arrived, ranging in age from 18 months to 16 years, and they were overseen by a woman called Mama Ngozi, who was strict in the way that people are strict when they do not have enough of anything and must enforce a fair distribution of the little they have. Mom and Ngozi ran the compound with a schedule and a sense of order that were, in their own way, a kind of love, not the tender demonstrative kind but the structural kind. The kind that says, I will make sure you have somewhere to sleep and something to eat, and I will not let anything carry you away. Amara thrived in structure the way some plants thrive in poor soil, not easily, not without effort, but with a deep stubborn rootedness that surprised even Mom and Ngozi. She was good at school in the particular way that children are good at school when they have decided that school is the only ladder available to them and they are going to climb every single rung. She read everything she could find. She did the younger children's homework with them, not because she was asked but because she had watched Ifeoma braid other people's hair with that same patient care, and she understood instinctively that care given freely is its own kind of currency. By the time she was 17, she was the kind of girl that teachers mentioned to other teachers. Composed, focused, the sort of composure that is not coldness but the outer surface of a very deep warmth that has learned to protect itself. She had a laugh that arrived quickly and completely and then disappeared again just as quickly, like a bright bird that lands and takes off before you have quite finished admiring it. She wanted to study. That was the thing she wanted most and most completely. Not wealth, she had no frame of reference for wealth and so had no specific hunger for it. What she wanted was knowledge. She wanted to understand how things worked, the body, medicine, the reasons people got sick and the reasons they got well and the reasons that sometimes had nothing to do with medicine at all. She wanted to be a nurse first and a doctor eventually, not for status but for the specific practical reason that she had watched her mother die in a room that smelled of antiseptic and insufficient care, and she had made a quiet private decision that if she could be the person standing on the other side of that equation, she would stand there. There was a scholarship. The Mission Foundation offered it every 2 years. 4 years of nursing school covered in full for one girl from the orphanage who met the academic requirements. Amara had met every requirement. She had exceeded them. Mama Ngozi had submitted her name and her records with the particular pride of a woman who has cultivated something against difficult odds and is now presenting the evidence. The scholarship committee was due to announce their decision in the first week of March. It was the second week of February when the church administrator came to the orphanage compound and spoke with Mama Ngozi for a long time in the small office that smelled of old paper and lamp oil. Amara was in the yard under the neem tree doing homework with 2 of the younger children when she heard Mama Ngozi's voice change. Not raise, not break, but change and register the way a voice changes when it is carrying something it did not expect to be asked to carry. She did not hear the words. She heard only the change. That evening Mama Ngozi called her in and told her, with a directness that was also a kind of mercy, sparing her the slow approach of bad news, that the church had approved an arrangement. A man, a very old man, a man of the congregation who had been known to the church administrators for some years, had expressed a wish to be properly cared for in his final years and had formally requested a young woman from the orphanage who would be his wife in the sense of companion and caretaker. The church would cover the orphanage's running expenses for the next year. There would be a monthly payment sent directly to the orphanage for as long as the arrangement lasted. Amara sat very still. The photograph of her mother was in the pocket of her dress because she had taken to carrying it there when she needed to feel held. Her hand went to it now without her deciding that it should. She said, "What about the scholarship?" Mama Ngozi was quiet for a moment that lasted longer than it should have. Then she said, "The scholarship has its own timing. This arrangement would begin immediately. They are not incompatible. But I want you to decide for yourself. I want that to be very clear. I am telling you what has been proposed. I am not telling you what to choose." But Amara could hear underneath those words, because she was a girl who had learned to hear the things underneath the words, the weight of the running expenses, the 22 children, the neem tree compound with its leaking roof that had been waiting for repair money for 2 seasons. She could hear the particular silence of someone who needs something badly and is trying very hard not to let the need speak louder than the choice. She was 19 years old. She said yes. The man's name was Ezekiel Nwosu. He was 95 years old, though he moved, she would later notice, with the quality of someone who has made a private negotiation with his own body and they have agreed to a kind of truce. He was tall in the way that very old men are sometimes tall, as though the body has decided that the one thing it will not surrender is height. His face was deeply lined, the skin close to the bone, the eyes behind it. This was the thing she noticed first, before she noticed anything else about him. The eyes were completely clear. Not the cloudy, unfocused eyes of an old man managing his hours. Clear the way still water is clear. Observing. He was brought to the orphanage by a man who introduced himself as the church deacon, and he arrived not in a car but on foot, leaning on the worn wooden cane, dressed in a plain cotton agbada that had been pressed carefully but was obviously old. He smelled of firewood smoke and something else she couldn't name, something medicinal like the bark of a tree that has been used for something important for a very long time. She had expected to meet an invalid. What she met instead was someone who looked at her the way her mother used to look at her. Completely and without judgment, as if he were not deciding anything about her but simply taking in the full fact of her. He shook her hand and his grip was dry and light, the way her mother's had been at the end, but with a different quality entirely. Not the lightness of leaving, but the lightness of a man who has put down everything heavy. He said, "They tell me your name is Amara." She said, "Yes, sir." He said, "I hope you will find me less troublesome than they have probably suggested." She did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing, and he seemed to find that completely acceptable. They were married in the church 3 weeks later. The ceremony was small and attended by the church administrator, 2 deacons, Mom and Gozi, and a handful of children from the orphanage who had come because they were curious and because Mom and Gozi had not had the energy to tell them they couldn't. Amara wore the old white dress. Ezekiel wore a fresh agbada, the same style as the first one but clearly newer, and someone had shined the wooden cane. He said his vows in a voice that was unhurried and precise, each word placed with the deliberate care of a man who has had a long time to decide what he means when he says something. After the ceremony, a car she had not seen before came to take them away. It was not a fine car. It was a small Peugeot that had seen better years, driven by a man who introduced himself only as Chitty, and who seemed to have had a long and complicated relationship with silence. He drove them through the city to a neighborhood she did not know, the kind of neighborhood where the roads were not exactly narrow but not exactly wide, where the buildings leaned against each other in a companionable way that suggested long habitation, where there were open drains along the road and electricity wires looping overhead in great tangled bundles between crooked poles. The house they stopped at was a single-story building with a low fence made of concrete blocks and a gate that had been painted green so long ago the color had faded to something between sage and gray. The compound inside was swept clean. There were 2 citrus trees and a small garden bed where something dark-leafed and purposeful was growing. The house itself had 3 rooms, a main room with a table and 2 chairs and a small shelf of books, a kitchen so basic it was almost theoretical, and a bedroom that had been set up with evident care, clean sheets, a mosquito net, a small table with a lamp. She stood in the doorway of the bedroom looking at it. Then she turned around. Ezekiel was watching her from the main room. He said, "I know it is not what you expected. Or perhaps it is exactly what you expected. Either way, I want you to know that I have no demands of you beyond your honesty. I am old. I am not confused about what I am or what this is. You have done a good thing by agreeing to be here. I will try to be worth the trouble." She wanted to say something, but the honesty he had asked for meant she had to admit she did not yet know what the true thing to say was. So she said, "I will make dinner." And she went to the theoretical kitchen and found, on the lower shelf, groundnut and palm oil and dried crayfish and stock cubes, and she thought, "Someone has been here before me. Someone who knew what a kitchen should have." And she began to cook. That first night she lay in the bed in the bedroom with the mosquito net and listened to Ezekiel's slow breathing from the main room, where he slept on a narrow cot he had insisted on setting up himself, refusing her help with a firmness that was not rude but absolutely clear, and she stared at the ceiling and thought about the scholarship announcement that was still 3 weeks away, and she allowed herself the private thought that perhaps this was only one chapter and not the whole story. She woke early. That was a habit from the orphanage. She woke and swept the compound before the sun was fully up, the way Mama Ngozi had required, the broom making the dry rasp of its own particular morning sound across the swept earth. She heard Ezekiel before she saw him, the tap of the wooden cane on the concrete step. He came out and sat in one of 2 low chairs near the citrus trees and watched the morning arrive with the same unhurried observation he had brought to everything she had seen him do. She made tea. She brought him a cup. He thanked her. They sat in a quiet that was not uncomfortable. This became the rhythm. the morning tea, the swept compound, breakfast. He ate very little, a small bowl of pap or a piece of bread and butter, and she learned quickly that offering him more only produced a polite and immovable refusal. She discovered in those first weeks that he was a man with a very precise relationship with necessity. He took exactly what he needed and nothing extra, from food to space to conversation. He was not cold. He was the opposite of cold. But he was exact. And there was something in that exactness that she recognized, the discipline of a person who has learned over a long life that wanting more than what you need is the beginning of a particular kind of suffering. He had books. The small shelf in the main room held 25 volumes, some in English, some in Igbo, a few in French, which surprised her. She noticed them over the first days and tried not to be too obviously interested, but on the third day when she was dusting the shelf she opened one of the French ones and found marginal notes in a small precise hand. Not underlining or emphasis but genuine dialogue with the text. Arguments. Questions. The occasional notation that said, "No, this is wrong and here is why." She said, "You speak French." He said, "I used to speak it better. I spent time there many years ago." She said, "In France." He said, "And other places. I have had a long time to collect places." She wanted to ask more. She stopped herself. She was not sure why she stopped herself, whether it was respect or caution or something else. But she put the book back carefully and resumed dusting the shelf. The scholarship announcement came. She was not selected. She found out in a letter that Mama Ngozi forwarded to her. She read it standing in the kitchen with the palm oil warming on the burner, and she stood there for a long time reading it again and then folded it very precisely, the way her mother used to fold important papers, into a small rectangle and put it in the pocket of her dress next to the photograph and did not let her face change. She served Ezekiel his lunch. She washed the plates. She sat under the citrus trees in the afternoon when the light came through the leaves in a way that was almost theatrical, and she allowed herself to feel the weight of it fully, privately, completely, and then she folded that away too, into the same interior pocket where she kept everything that could not be fixed right now. Ezekiel came and sat in the chair beside her. He did not say anything at first, just sat, the cane leaning against the arm of the chair, the afternoon light on his face. Then he said, "A door has closed." She said, "Yes." He said, "Were you depending on it?" She said, "Yes. I was going to study nursing. I wanted to be a doctor eventually." He was quiet again for a moment. Then he said, "That desire, where did it come from?" And she found herself telling him about Iphioma, about the room with the low ceiling, about the hospital smell and the labored breathing and the hand growing light. She had not told anyone this story completely since she was 11 years old. She told it to this old man under the citrus trees without looking at him, looking at the garden bed with the dark-leafed plants, and she did not cry. She simply told it. When she was done, he was quiet for a long time. He said, "Your mother said something true to you. You carry it well." She looked at him then. She said, "How did you know she said something?" He said, "Because you move like someone who was told something true at a critical moment and believed it." She had no answer for that. She began to learn him. It was not a romantic learning. She was clear with herself about what this was and what it was not, and she did not allow the clarity to become a wall she hid behind, only a fact she lived alongside. She learned that he rose every morning before dawn and sat outside alone for about an hour before she got up. She knew because she had risen early twice and seen the chair still warm. She learned that he disliked any kind of waste, food, water, words. She learned that he had a habit, when he was thinking about something difficult, of tapping the end of his cane against the ground twice, a soft, deliberate rhythm. She learned that Chitty, the quiet driver, came once a week to bring market supplies that were always exactly what was needed and never anything extra. She learned that neighbors came by sometimes. Older men and women who sat with Ezekiel in the compound and spoke in a register of conversation she recognized as the particular cadence of people who have known each other for decades and no longer need to explain themselves. They were respectful to her without being warm. They looked at her with the same quality of observation she had begun to recognize in Ezekiel's face. A measuring that was not unkind but was completely serious. She cooked. She cleaned. She managed the small household with the efficiency she had learned at the orphanage, where efficiency was not a preference but a survival requirement. She read Ezekiel's books in the afternoons when the chores were done. He noticed. He said nothing about it for 2 weeks, And then one day he came back from wherever he had gone with Chitty and placed a new book on the shelf. A medical text, an anatomy volume, old but comprehensive with detailed illustrations. He said nothing. He simply placed it there and went to his chair. She picked it up that evening and held it for a moment before she opened it. It was a specific kind of kindness, the kind that arrives without ceremony and asks for no acknowledgement. The kind she had only ever associated with her mother. She slept well in this house. That surprised her more than anything else about her new life. She had expected to lie awake with the weight of the choice she had made, with the particular quality of loss that comes from the life you decided not to live pressing up against the life you are actually in. Instead, she slept deeply and woke rested and found, to her own confusion, that she was not unhappy. She was not happy in the way that requires specific desired things to be present. But she was not unhappy. There was a stability to the days that she had not known in the orphanage. Not the institutional stability of schedule and rule, but the organic stability of a life that had a center, a daily rhythm, a purpose that was small and immediate and real. She wrote to Mom Ngozi. She said, "I am well. The work is not difficult. He is a quiet man but not unkind." She did not say anything more than that because she did not yet have words for the rest. It was in the 4th month that she found the notebook. She was cleaning the main room, a proper cleaning, moving furniture, getting into corners, the way she did every 6 weeks. She moved the small table beside Ezekiel's cot, and behind the leg of the table, half pushed against the wall, was a notebook, a standard green cover exercise book, the kind you could buy at any stationery stall in any market. She picked it up. She was not going to read it. She set it on the table and continued cleaning, and then she stopped. The notebook had fallen open. She could not help seeing the line it had fallen open to. What she saw was not a personal journal entry. What she saw was a column of numbers. Numbers of a particular size. She stood there with the broom in her hand. The numbers were large in the way that makes your mind adjust its frame of reference like a camera refocusing, where first you see one thing and then you see that the scale of what you are looking at is entirely different from what you assumed. She set the broom against the wall. She picked up the notebook and she looked at it. It was not a journal. It was a record, precise, organized, written in that same small, careful hand she had seen in the margins of the French book of transactions, transfers, holdings, the kind of record a careful person makes when they want to keep track of something significant. There were account names she did not recognize. There were amounts she had no frame of reference for. There were dates going back decades. And across the top of the page that the notebook had fallen open to, written in a slightly heavier hand, as if the writer had wanted to mark it deliberately, the words, "Final allocation pending." She put the notebook down exactly where she had found it. She pushed the table back into position. She picked up the broom. She continued cleaning the room with great care and thoroughness, moving through each corner methodically, and when she was done she went to the kitchen and stood at the window for a long time looking at the citrus trees. Her mind was doing what her mind had always done with information it could not yet place. Not panicking, not constructing narratives, but holding the facts very still and examining them from every angle until she understood what she actually knew versus what she was assuming. What she actually knew was this. There was a notebook with a record of significant financial transactions. The notebook belonged to Ezekiel. The amounts in the notebook were not the amounts of a poor man. They were the amounts of... She did not yet let herself finish the sentence. That evening she made jollof rice with goat meat, which she had learned was his preferred dinner when the weather was cool. She served it and sat across the table from him and watched him eat with the same precise economy he brought to everything, and she thought, "Who are you?" She did not say it. She watched him and she thought it. He looked up and found her looking and said, "You have something to say." She said, "I found your notebook when I was cleaning. Fell open. I put it back." He set down his fork. He looked at her with those completely clear eyes. Then he said, "What did you see?" She said, "I saw numbers I don't know how to account for. Given the way we live." There was a long silence. Not an uncomfortable one. The kind of silence that is a person deciding something. He said, "I wondered when." She said, "When what?" He said, "When you would find something, or hear something, or simply start to add things together. You are not an inattentive person, Amara." She said, "Who are you, sir?" And he told her. He had been born in a village 3 days' walk from the city, the fifth child of a man who farmed yam and a woman who sold cloth in the market. He had been clever in school with the desperate cleverness of a child who has identified the only available path and is determined to take it. He had received one of the very few scholarships available to boys from his kind of background, and had gone to a university in the city at 17 and had studied mathematics and economics with a focus that his professors described in letters she would later find as almost frightening in its completeness. He had graduated. He had gone abroad, not named, not specific, simply the other side of the world, the place where people go when the opportunity to become something is larger than what the place where you were born can contain. He had worked. He had been very good at working. He had an understanding of financial structures and market behavior that was, his colleagues would later say, less like analysis and more like listening, as if he could hear what the numbers were saying beneath the surface of what they appeared to mean. He had built wealth in the way that very few people build it, not through inheritance, not through luck, not through the particular ruthlessness that sometimes looks like strategy, but through genuine intelligence applied consistently over decades to the question of where value actually lived and how to recognize it before anyone else did. He had given most of it away. That was the sentence she kept returning to, that first night when she sat in bed in the dark after he had told her all of it, that particular sentence. He had given most of it away, not to causes or institutions but to specific people, individuals who came to his attention through the networks he had moved through across his lifetime, people he had decided were worth the investment of real resources. A medical student from the South who had the potential and not the money. A woman in the North who had built a small school in her compound with her own resources and needed a proper roof and a well. A cooperative of market women in the East whose operation was strangled by the absence of working capital. He kept enough, a very precise enough, to live simply, because he had found, he told her, over a very long life of having had everything and then choosing to have much less, that simplicity was not poverty. It was, in fact, the most expensive thing he had ever acquired, because it had cost him every idea he had ever had about what a life was supposed to look like. She listened to all of this in the main room, the two of them sitting across from each other in the lamplight, the wooden cane leaning against his chair. When he was done, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Why the arrangement? Why the orphanage? Why come to the church and do it this way?" He said, "Because I am old. Because I have lived alone a long time and I have found that a house with no one in it is not a home but a waiting room. Because," and here he paused, and the two-tap rhythm of the cane on the floor came and then stopped, "because I spent too many years moving through a world where everyone who came close to me came close because of the money. And I found that I could not always tell, after a while, who the person was beneath the access they were seeking." He looked at her directly. He said, "You came here not knowing. That is an unusual thing. I wanted to see what it was." She said, "And what is it?" He said, "A person. Complete one." She sat with that for a moment. Then she said, "I need to think." He said, "Of course you do." She went to the bedroom. She lay in the dark. She put her hand on the photograph in her dress pocket. She thought about the fact of this, the particular strange fact of it, of sitting in a small clean house with a man who had more money than she had language for and had chosen this. The discipline of chosen simplicity. The deliberate invisibility of a man who had been visible enough and had decided that what he needed more than visibility was truth. And she thought, "I am also a person who chose something. I chose to come here without knowing. And I am still here." In the morning she made tea. She brought him his cup. She sat in the second chair under the citrus trees. She said, "I want to study medicine. I want to be a doctor. Not because of the money. I need you to believe that. I need that to be the first thing I say, that it has nothing to do with that. But I need you to know what I want because you asked for my honesty and I intend to give it to you." He wrapped both hands around his cup. He said, "I know." She said, "How do you know?" He said, "Because I read your file before I agreed to the arrangement. Mama Ngozi sent me a file and it had your academic records and a letter she had written. I read it 3 times. The third time I thought, this is a person who should not be inside this particular situation. And then I thought, that is precisely why she should be inside it for a while and then she should not be." She looked at him. She said, "You plan to help me." He said, "I plan to observe. Planning to help is presumptuous. But I am old enough to know that some things become inevitable once you start paying attention." 6 months later she was enrolled in the medical school. Ezekiel had made arrangements, not dramatic ones, Not the sweeping gesture of a man putting his name on buildings, but quiet specific arrangements of the kind she would come to recognize as his signature. A scholarship foundation she had never heard of that turned out to have his name in its original documents, written there decades ago for exactly this kind of purpose. An administrator who received a phone call and became suddenly very accommodating about the question of late enrollment. A schedule worked out with Chitty that allowed her to be at the hospital for her practical training and still come home in the evenings to a house where the lamp was on and there was food warming on the burner. Because she still came home. That was her choice. No one asked her to. She made it the same way she had made every other choice in her life. Quietly, completely, without announcement. She studied in the mornings before the compound was awake. She studied in the evenings after dinner while Ezekiel read in the chair across from her. The two of them quiet in a room that had become, she realized one evening without having decided when it happened, the most like home of any place she had ever lived. She asked him questions, medical questions at first, then economic ones, then questions about the world he had moved through, the decades, the different cities on the other side of the world and what they had taught him. He answered all of them with the same precision and completeness, never shortening an answer out of impatience, never extending it out of any desire to seem more than he was. She learned that he had been married once, long ago, to a woman called Adana who had died very young of a fever that came in the rainy season in the year when they had just begun to understand that they had found in each other something rare. He spoke of Adana once, only once, on an evening when the rain was heavy and the compound smelled of wet earth, and his voice did not change when he spoke of her. Not because he felt nothing, but because what he felt was so large and so settled that it had moved past the point where voices change. She understood something then about the quality of stillness in him. It was not emptiness. It was the stillness of a man who has already lived through everything that most people are still afraid of. There was a complication she had not prepared for. The church administrator, a man named Brother Festus who wore his self-importance the way other men wear expensive watches, visibly, permanently, without apparent awareness that it was something to be put down, had been watching the situation at the house on the faded green gate with a mounting dissatisfaction he had not bothered to examine too closely. He had expected. He had not exactly said this to anyone, but the expectation had been operating in him the whole time, that the arrangement would proceed in a particular direction, that the old man would decline in his health as old men do, that the household would require management of a particular kind, that he, as the church administrator who had facilitated the arrangement, would be well positioned to be involved in whatever came next. He came to the house on a Wednesday afternoon while Amara was at the hospital. He found Ezekiel alone in the compound under the citrus trees. He sat in the chair that was usually Amara's chair. He said various things in the manner of a man who wants to arrive at a destination without appearing to have set out for it, about the orphanage, about the church's obligations, about the arrangements that had been made and whether they might be reviewed, adjusted. He used the word adjusted in light of what seemed to be changing circumstances. Ezekiel listened to all of this. He tapped his cane twice on the ground. He said, "What circumstances do you believe have changed?" Brother Festus said, "Well, there are rumors. People talk. There are suggestions about the nature of this household and the nature of your—" Ezekiel said, "The rumors are wrong or the rumors are right." Brother Festus said, "I simply think it would be appropriate for me to be more closely involved, given that I facilitated." Ezekiel said, "You arranged a marriage, not a partnership. Your involvement was complete the day the vows were spoken." Brother Festus left. He was not a man who left quietly, but there was something in the way Ezekiel had spoken, without heat, without contempt, with simply the absolute weight of a man who has lived long enough to be completely unimpressed by a small person's large sense of themselves, that reduced Brother Festus to the most accurate version of himself, which was a man who had been told he was not needed and had nothing to offer in return. But he did not stop. He found Amara at the hospital. He came in the afternoon when she was between wards, still in her training uniform, her hair pulled back, carrying a clipboard because she always carried a clipboard. He looked at her with the particular expression of a man who has decided to deliver a warning that is actually a threat wearing kindness's clothes. He said, "I am concerned about you. The situation you are in is not normal. People are asking questions. Your reputation, a young woman like you living with an old man, attending school on money that—" He paused deliberately, "has an unclear source." She stood very still. Her hands did not move. Her face did not move. She said, "Brother Festus, with respect, I do not need your concern." He said, "I am trying to help you." She said, "I believe you are trying to establish a position. I don't think those are the same thing." He left. But the damage he had been trying to cause had found some of its target, because the next day 2 of her fellow students asked her, with the particular oblique intimacy of young people who want information but don't want to seem to want it, about where she was living and with whom. She answered truthfully. She was married, her husband was elderly. She lived in his house. She watched their faces process this and form the particular expression that faces form when they have decided a story without enough information to actually decide it. She went home that evening. Ezekiel was at the table. He looked up and read something in the quality of her stillness that most people would have missed entirely. He said, "Sit down." She sat. He said, "Tell me what happened." She did. All of it, Brother Festus at the hospital, the students, the particular quality of the day. She told it with the same evenness she brought to everything difficult. When she was done, he was quiet. Then he said, "I should have anticipated this." She said, "It is not your fault." He said, "That is kind of you. It is also not the point. The question is what we do with it." She said, "I don't see that there is anything to do with it. I live my life. People make of it what they make of it." He said, "That is true, but it is incomplete. There are situations where doing nothing is itself a choice that has weight." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think it is time." She said, "Time for what?" He said, "For some things to become less obscure than I have made them." She did not fully understand what he meant until 3 weeks later, when a car arrived at the house. Not Chitty's old Peugeot, but a different car entirely, large and dark and quiet in the way expensive things are quiet. And 2 men got out who were clearly lawyers in the way that lawyers have a particular quality of carefulness about them, of moving through spaces as if they are always taking inventory. They sat at the table in the main room that was usually just large enough for 2 cups of tea and some books, and they opened folders on it, and they spoke to Ezekiel for a long time in low voices while Amara sat in the compound under the citrus trees and looked at the dark-leaf plants in the garden bed. Chitty came and sat in Ezekiel's chair beside her. He had never done that before. She looked at him. He said, "You are not frightened." She said, "I don't have enough information to know what to be frightened of." He said, "That is a very sensible way to live." She said, "You have known him a long time." He said, 31 years. She said, "And you knew everything." He said, "I knew enough to be very careful with it." She said, "Why is he doing this?" Chitty looked at the citrus trees for a moment. Then he said, "He waited a long time to find someone he trusted. He has many people around him who want access. He wanted someone who didn't know there was anything to access. He said it was the only honest test left to him." She sat with that. Inside the house, the lawyers were drafting documents. The nature of those documents would become clear in stages, the way Ezekiel did everything. Not all at once, not as a performance, but carefully, specifically, at the pace that made sense. He was not dying. That was the first thing she needed to understand, he told her afterward. He was old. He was very old. He might live another year or another 5 years or, at the rate he was going, another decade, because his body had apparently decided that his particular quality of economy extended to the consumption of his own life, and he was going to use precisely as much of it as there was before he was done with it. But he was not dying in any imminent sense, and he was not arranging his affairs because his affairs were in disorder. He was arranging them because he had found, in this small house with the faded green gate and the citrus trees and the girl who swept the compound before the sun was up, something he had not expected to find again. He had found someone to trust with the truth of his life. What he was doing was this. He was establishing a foundation, a proper legal foundation with proper legal structure, that would continue the work he had been doing quietly for decades. The work of finding specific people with specific capability and specific need and connecting one to the other with resources. Not charity. Not the kind of giving that creates dependence or performs its own generosity. The kind of giving that creates conditions. He was putting in place the structure that would allow that work to continue after he could no longer personally oversee it. And he was asking Amara to be its director. She said, "I am a second-year medical student." He said, "You are also a person who has been managing complex resource constraints since you were 11 years old and who has demonstrated across 6 months of observation that her judgment about what matters and what does not is among the clearest I have encountered in 9.5 decades of paying attention. Medical school can run alongside this. In fact, medical school is part of the qualification for this. She said, I don't know how to run a foundation. He said, I didn't know how to build one either the first time. She said, this is too much. He said, it is a great deal. That is not the same thing. She stood up and walked to the window and looked out at the compound and the citrus trees and thought about her mother and the specific weight of the thing her mother had said to her in a room that smelled of antiseptic and love and insufficient resources. You are not what has happened to you. You are what you decide to do with what has happened to you. She turned around. She said, I will need to understand everything. Every account. Every previous grant. Every person you have helped and how and why. I will need to understand the whole picture before I can be responsible for any part of it. He said, of course. She said, and I will finish medical school. That is not negotiable. He said, I would not have it any other way. She said, and the orphanage. Whatever arrangement we make with the orphanage needs to be independent of any personal arrangement. It needs to stand on its own and be reliable and not contingent on anything about my circumstances. He looked at her for a long time. He said, you came to that condition immediately, before anything else. She said, those are children. He said, yes. He was quiet for a moment. He said, Adana would have liked you very much. She did not know what to do with that. She stood very still. And then she said, thank you, sir. He said, Ezekiel. After everything, please call me Ezekiel. Brother Festus found out about the foundation through a professional contact of his who had professional contacts with several law firms. And the news of it arrived at him in stages that each time rearranged his face into a new configuration of consternation. He came to the house. He came to the house 3 times. The first time, Amara answered the gate and told him calmly that Ezekiel was not receiving visitors that day. The second time, he came with a deacon and asked to speak to both of them about, he chose his words carefully, community implications. Ezekiel received them in the main room, the 2 lawyers present also, and spoke for approximately 7 minutes, at the end of which Brother Festus left in the condition of a man who has been shown clearly, and without cruelty, exactly where the ceiling of his relevance is located. The third time, he did not come himself but sent a letter, which Ezekiel read and placed on the shelf between 2 books and did not respond to. The foundation was registered. The structure was in place. Amara studied its existing ledgers with the same focused intensity she brought to anatomy, learning the body of it, the way the different parts connected, the flow of resources from source to application. She found, in those ledgers, the full record of what Ezekiel had been doing quietly for 40 years. She found the medical student who had become a cardiologist. She found the women's cooperative that had become a regional network of 600 members. She found, in the earliest entries, a line item for a primary school in a village 3 days from the city, a village that was, she had come to understand, the village where Ezekiel had been born. She found, in the most recent entries, dated to the week after their marriage, a line item for the orphanage where she had grown up. Not a 1-year operational expense as the original arrangement had specified. A 20-year endowment. The kind of number that removes a problem so completely it becomes instead a foundation to build from. She sat with that ledger open on the table for a long time and said nothing. That evening she asked him, "Did you know when you agreed to the arrangement that you would do this?" He said, "I knew I would do it if you turned out to be who I thought you were." She said, "And if I wasn't?" He said, "Then I would have done it anyway and found a different reason. Those children deserve to be there regardless of who you are." She went to her room. She sat on the edge of the bed. She held the photograph of her mother and she looked at it for a long time. Ifeoma's face, young and tired and completely present, looking directly at whoever held the camera with the expression of a woman who has decided to look the world straight in the eye. She said very quietly to the photograph, "I think I understand what you meant. The years that followed were not simple ones. No real years are. The foundation work was complex and demanding in ways she had not anticipated, not in the management of money, which she learned to do with a rigor that would have satisfied even Ezekiel's standards, but in the harder work of finding the specific people, of making the judgment calls about which need was connected to which capability, of resisting the particular gravitational pull of visible, obvious causes when what she was looking for was often invisible and quiet. She made mistakes. She owned them and learned from them and applied the learning with the same efficiency she had always brought to available resources. She finished medical school. She began her residency in internal medicine. The hospital where she trained was not prestigious. It was a public hospital in a dense part of the city with overwhelmed staff and insufficient equipment and the particular quality of dignity that comes from people choosing to do important work in genuinely difficult conditions. She chose it deliberately. She worked harder there than she had thought she was capable of working. Her colleagues thought she was driven by ambition. She was driven by something quieter, the specific memory of a room with a low ceiling and a woman whose hand was growing light. Ezekiel came to her graduation. Chitty drove him in the old Peugeot, which had been repaired so many times it was practically a philosophical exercise in continuity. Ezekiel wore a new agbada. She could tell it was new because the fabric was stiff with it, and he carried the wooden cane and he sat in the audience with the other families, and when they called her name he did not clap loudly the way some people clapped. He pressed both hands together slowly once and inclined his head, and she, crossing the stage in her white coat, saw it from the corner of her eye and looked away quickly before her face could do something public. He was 99 years old. He was slower now, not diminished but slower, the way that very old trees are not dying when they move slowly in the wind, but are demonstrating the particular physics of something rooted very deep. He needed her help sometimes in ways he had not before, and he accepted it with the same economy he had brought to everything, not gracefully in the performative sense but accurately. He needed the help. She provided it. That was the shape of it. She became his doctor too, eventually, not formally, not with charts and official records, but in the daily practical sense of knowing his body's particular patterns and needs and adjustments. She monitored what needed to be monitored. She managed what could be managed. She sat with the parts that could not be managed and learned something in that sitting about the difference between curing and caring that she had read in textbooks but now understood in her body. He told her once, on an evening when the rain was heavy and the compound smelled of wet earth, which always brought Adana's name into the air without either of them saying it. He told her that the single best decision he had made in his very long life was to keep the wooden cane, because it had forced him to move slowly enough to see what was actually there. She said, "And what did you see?" He said, "This." He did not elaborate. He was a man who had learned, over a long time, the precise weight a single word could carry when it was placed correctly. Ezekiel Nwosu died on a morning in the dry season, 3 years after the graduation, sitting in his chair under the citrus trees in the early hours before the sun was fully up, which was exactly where and when he had always wanted to be when the time came. Amara found him there when she rose. She stood at the door and looked at him for a long moment, and then she went and sat in the chair beside him and held his hand, which was dry and light in the particular way she had learned to recognize. And she stayed there until Chitty came and knew without being told. She carried the obituary in the left pocket of her doctor's coat for 3 weeks after the funeral, folded into the same small rectangle she used for all important papers, until the fold lines were soft with handling. The obituary ran in 2 newspapers and 1 online publication, and it listed his accomplishments in the measured tone of public records, and it was accurate as far as it went, but it did not say the things that mattered, which was that he had sat in a chair under citrus trees with a girl who had nowhere to go and had looked at her with completely clear eyes and decided she was worth the trouble of truth. She had the wooden cane. Chitty had brought it to her after the funeral, carried it in both hands, set it against her office wall without a word. She did not use it. She stood it in the corner of her office where she could see it from her desk. The foundation continued. It was larger now, the structure was more complex, the reach was wider, the team she had built around her was careful and specific in the way she required. She still made the final decisions herself on the individual grants, the specific people, because she had inherited from a 95-year-old man the understanding that the most important work is always personal and specific and cannot be delegated without losing something essential in the translation. The orphanage compound had a new roof. It had a well. It had a library with books on shelves that went all the way to the ceiling and a reading chair in the corner for the child who needed to be alone with a story. The neem tree was still there, so large and old it seemed to belong to a different era, and under it on Saturdays the children sat with their homework, and sometimes Amara came, in her years of work and visiting, and sat with them, not formally, not as an administrator, but as someone who had once been a child in a compound exactly like this one and knew what it was to need someone to sit down beside you. She planted 2 citrus trees in the orphanage compound. She did not explain them. She watered them herself the first season. After that, the children took over without being asked. Children have a particular instinct for things that are growing. The girl who had stood at the door of the church in a dress the color of old teeth. The girl who had made a choice in the dark of a dormitory room without knowing everything that choice would cost her or everything it would return. That girl had not disappeared. She had become a doctor who could sit with the unfixable and still be useful. She had become a steward of resources in the precise and personal way her teacher had modeled. She had become a woman who swept the compound before sunrise not because she was required to but because there is something true about beginning the day with a task that serves the space you share with others. She still carried the photograph. It was soft now at the edges from a decade and a half of handling. Ifeoma's face was still clear in it, still looking straight at the camera, still demonstrating that particular refusal to look away from the world as it actually was. Amara carried it in her left coat pocket, the doctor's coat now, and sometimes when she was about to walk into a difficult situation, a patient whose prognosis was hard, a conversation about a grant rejection, a room where she was going to have to tell someone something they were not ready to hear, she would put her hand in her pocket and touch the photograph and feel the soft worn edges of it and be, for a moment, held. And now, after all of it, after the swept compound and the groundnut soup and the notebooks with precise handwriting in the margins, after the medical school and the residency and the foundation and the citrus trees and the wooden cane in the corner of her office, after everything, what remains? What remains is this. A girl who had nothing chose to step through a door she couldn't see past. And on the other side of it was not the diminishment of herself but the expansion. What remains is the lesson, and it is a harder one than it appears, because it is not the lesson that says wealth solves everything. It is the lesson that says that the truest forms of wealth, in care, in knowledge, in the willingness to be completely honest with someone, can live in a house with 3 rooms and a faded green gate and 2 citrus trees that someone decided were worth planting. What remains is the lesson of Ezekiel Nwosu, who lived 98 years and spent most of them moving quietly through the world in a way that accumulated more than money, that accumulated trust and truth, and the particular satisfaction of a life whose values and actions were the same thing. He moved slowly. He saw clearly. He gave specifically. He chose honestly. And at the end he died in a chair in the early morning light, in a compound that smelled of earth and citrus, with his hand held by someone who had chosen to know him truly. What remains is the lesson of Ifeoma, who had almost nothing and gave her daughter the one thing that cannot be taken, the knowledge that you are not what has happened to you. You are what you decide to do with what has happened to you. That is not a motivational phrase. That is a description of the actual architecture of a human life. The things that happen to you are the material. The choosing is the building. Every day, every choice, the hands and the material and what you decide to make. And if you are sitting where you are sitting right now, if you are reading this or hearing this from wherever life has placed you, whatever door it has opened or closed for you, whatever compact you have had to make with circumstances you did not choose, here is the question that this story leaves on the table for you. What door is standing in front of you right now that you are afraid to walk through? Not because you can see what is on the other side, but because you cannot. And what would you discover about yourself if you trusted that your own hands are worth the darkness of not yet knowing?